Hello, come on in, get comfortable. Tonight we're going to spend some real time with someone who lived quite a life. Her name was Mary Howard, though for most of her life she signed herself Mary Richmond, and history usually files her under Henry FitzRoy. She was the daughter of the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, the sister of one of the finest poets England ever produced, the first cousin of 2 queens who both died on a scaffold, and the wife of the only son King Henry VIII ever publicly acknowledged. She was married at 14, she was a widow at 17, and she died at 38. In her own house, in her own bed, with her own money, which in that family was close to a miracle. Most books give her a paragraph, some give her a footnote. Tonight she gets the whole evening. Let me put you somewhere first. It is a December evening in 1546, a room in Westminster, candles lit early because the light goes at 4 o'clock this time of year. Mary is 27 years old. She has been brought before a committee of the King's Privy Council, and the men sitting across from her are not asking her about the weather. They want to know about her brother. They want to know what he said to her, and when, and in what room, and who else heard it, and she tells them. She tells them that her brother, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, came to her with a plan. The king was dying. Everybody knew the king was dying. And Surrey's plan was that Mary should make herself agreeable to him, that she should go to the old, sick, enormous king and become what Anne Boleyn had once been to him, and use that position to steer the succession toward the Howards, her own brother, asking that, or so she says. The clerk writes it down, and 5 weeks later, on a cold morning at Tower Hill, Surrey kneels down and the axe comes down, and one of the great voices of English poetry stops mid-sentence at the age of about 30. We will get back to that room. I want you to be able to stand in it properly by the time we do, which means we have a great deal of ground to cover first. If this is the kind of story you want to hear all the way through, go ahead and subscribe, and leave a comment if you have a life you'd like me to spend an evening on. It genuinely helps. Now, 3 things I want us to find out about Mary tonight. First, how does a girl raised inside the most aggressively Catholic household in England end up hiring one of the most famous Protestant writers of the century to teach her nephews? Second, why does a woman who was offered good marriages, repeatedly, by powerful men, turn down every single one of them for 21 years? And third, the one that will sit with you when she stood in that room in December and opened her mouth, was she a woman being broken, or a woman who had decided? Those are the questions. Let's go get the answers. We start in the year 1529, in a house in Norfolk, with a girl of about 10 being told what she is for. Her father had come back from court. That in itself was ordinary. Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, was forever coming back from court, trailing news and grievances and instructions, and the household would rearrange itself around him the way iron filings rearrange around a magnet. What was not ordinary was the news. The king had a son. Not a legitimate one, everyone knew about that. The whole kingdom knew about that. It was the central catastrophe of the reign. But a real, living, healthy boy of 10, born to a gentlewoman named Elizabeth Blount, and the king had made that boy a duke twice over before his 7th birthday. And now the king was thinking about who the boy should marry. He was thinking about Mary. She was 10 years old. She had never, as far as anyone recorded, had a conversation with the boy in question, though she had almost certainly seen him because her brother knew him well. And what she was being told, in the plainest possible terms, was that her body and her name had been entered into a negotiation at the highest level of the English state, and that the negotiation would proceed with or without her opinion, and that her opinion had not been requested and would not be. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make that sound worse than it was, and also easy to make it sound better. This was not a shock to her. Every girl of her rank grew up knowing exactly this was coming. Her own mother had been handed across in precisely the same way. What made this particular arrangement different was the altitude. To marry the king's son, even the king's illegitimate son, was to be lifted out of the ordinary aristocratic marriage market entirely and set down somewhere near the throne. in the thin air where the family could not protect her and where a mistake could not be walked back. Her father was delighted. Of course he was delighted. It was, from where he sat, an extraordinary piece of business. So let's talk about him, because you cannot understand a single decision Mary made in her life without understanding the man who raised her. Thomas Howard was in his mid-50s in 1529, and he had already survived more than most men survive in 3 lifetimes. The Howards had come out of the Norman period and climbed steadily, and then, in 1485, they made the single worst wager available in English history. They backed Richard III at Bosworth. Mary's great-grandfather died on that field. Her grandfather was captured, attainted, stripped of the dukedom, and put in the Tower, and he sat there for 3.5 years while the new Tudor king decided what to do with him. What the family learned from that experience was not loyalty. What the family learned was that titles are on loan, that the crown can take everything with a signature, and that the only intelligent posture toward a king is total, immediate, visible usefulness. Her grandfather clawed the dukedom back the hard way. He served, he administered, he kept his head down for 2 decades. And then in 1513, at the age of 70, he took an army north and destroyed a Scottish invasion at Flodden and killed a king of Scotland in the process. And the Howards were restored, fully and permanently, in a single afternoon. That was the story Mary grew up inside. Not a story about honour, a story about recovery. The Howards fall and the Howards get back up, and getting back up requires a kind of ruthlessness that other families can afford to be squeamish about. Her father had absorbed the lesson completely. Thomas Howard was a small, dry, hard, chronically irritated man with an old soldier's contempt for anyone who had not been shot at. He had commanded in Ireland, he had commanded at sea, he had commanded in France. He was competent at almost everything and warm at almost nothing, and he possessed one quality above all others that kept him alive for 80 years in the most lethal court in Europe. He could tell, earlier than anyone else in the room, which way the king was about to turn, and he would already be facing that direction when the king got there. He watched Cardinal Wolsey rise to a height no commoner in England had ever reached, and he watched him fall, and he helped push. He would watch Thomas More go to the block, and John Fisher, and eventually Thomas Cromwell. He would preside over the trials of 2 of his own nieces, and send them both to their deaths. He was, in a strictly technical sense, the most successful courtier of the entire Tudor century, and the way he achieved it was by being willing to let go of absolutely anything at absolutely any moment. Mary watched all of that happen from close range, starting when she was too young to have words for it, and what she took from it was not a conclusion she ever wrote down, because women in her position did not write down conclusions, but you can read it backward from her life, and the conclusion was roughly this: her father's method worked, and she wanted no part of it. There was one other thing in the house. Her father kept a mistress. Not discreetly, not at a distance, not in a separate establishment across the county the way a man was expected to manage these things. He kept her in the household. Her name was Bess Holland, and the family called her a laundress or a chamberer, or the daughter of the Duke's steward, depending on who was doing the insulting. And she lived under the same roof as the Duchess, and she wore jewels that had belonged to the Duchess, and she was, by every account we have, entirely secure in her position. The Duchess was Mary's mother, and Mary's mother was not the kind of woman who suffered in silence. Elizabeth Stafford had been born to expect a great deal. Her father was Edward Stafford, 3rd Duke of Buckingham, and Buckingham was not merely rich. He was royal, descended from Edward III, by a route direct enough that the Tudors found it uncomfortable to think about. He had the largest private income in England. He kept a household of hundreds. He built himself a castle in Gloucestershire so ostentatious that people made jokes about it, and he never quite grasped that the joke was becoming a warning. She had also been in love, or something adjacent to it, and she said so, in writing, decades later, with a bitterness that had not cooled in 30 years. She had been promised to Ralph Neville, the heir to the Earl of Westmoreland, That was the match she wanted. And then her father changed his mind, because Thomas Howard's first wife had died, and Thomas Howard was newly available, and Thomas Howard was the better political instrument, and Elizabeth was informed that she would be marrying him instead. She was about 17. He was about 40. She married him in 1512, and she was still writing furious letters about it in 1537. Then, in 1521, her father was arrested. Buckingham had talked too freely, for too many years, to too many people, about what might happen if the king died without a son, and about who might reasonably be considered next. He had also, unforgivably, been overheard discussing a prophecy. He was tried by his peers in Westminster Hall. The man who presided over the court, as Lord High Steward, was the Duke of Norfolk, Mary's grandfather, and when he pronounced the sentence, the chroniclers say, he wept. He pronounced it anyway. Buckingham was beheaded on Tower Hill in May of 1521. So, Mary's mother watched her own father go to the scaffold, condemned by a court presided over by her own father-in-law. That happened roughly 2 years before Mary was born. It was not history in that house. It was the previous week. It was the thing that explained why her mother's family had no money and no standing and no capacity to help her. And it was the reason her mother had nowhere to go, because by the 1520s, Elizabeth Stafford wanted very much to go. The marriage had gone past unhappy and into something with a harder edge. She wrote about it later to Thomas Cromwell, at length, repeatedly, in letters that survive and that are genuinely difficult to read. She wrote that her husband had taken up with Bess Holland and installed her in the household. She wrote that when she objected, women of the household Bess Holland's allies, she said, her own servants turned against her, held her down, and sat on her chest until she spat blood. She wrote that she had been locked in a room. She wrote that her jewels and her clothes had been given away. She wrote that she had been put out of the house with a pension so small it was an insult, and left at a manor at Redbourne in Hertfordshire, and that her husband had not troubled to see her in years. Her husband's version, also in writing, was that his wife was impossible, that she had a temper like a scolded cat, that she had made his life a misery for 20 years, and that everything she said about violence was a lie. He wrote that she was mad. It was, he insisted, all her own doing. We cannot referee this. We were not there, and neither was anyone who wrote about it. What we can say with total confidence is that the marriage detonated, publicly, in front of everyone, over a period of years, and that Mary spent her entire childhood and adolescence inside the blast radius. And here is the part that matters most for tonight, and the part that most accounts leave out because it is not flattering to anybody. The children took their father's side. Elizabeth Stafford wrote about that too, and it is the only place in her letters where the fury drops away and something worse comes through. She wrote that her own children had turned against her. She used the word unnatural. She named her son. She named her daughter. She said they had taken the Duke's part and Bess Holland's part against their own mother, and that they came to her with instructions to be reasonable, to accept the terms, to reconcile, to stop writing letters to Cromwell that embarrassed the family. Mary was somewhere in her teens through most of this, old enough to understand exactly what she was doing. I've thought about that a good deal, and I don't think it needs excusing, and I don't think it needs condemning either. I think it needs stating plainly, because it is the earliest hard evidence we have of how Mary's mind worked. Her mother was right about the facts and had no power. Her father was wrong about the facts and had all of it. And Mary, at 15 or 16, looked at that arrangement and made the calculation that a child makes when a child understands that only one parent can actually protect them. She was not being cruel, she was being accurate, and she would spend the rest of her life demonstrating that she had never forgiven herself for how accurate she had been. Elizabeth Stafford never reconciled. She never went back. She lived at Redbourne on her reduced allowance, writing her letters, refusing every settlement that required her to acknowledge Bess Holland, refusing to attend court functions where she would be expected to smile. She outlived her husband. She outlived her son, And this is the detail that gets me. Every time I come back to this story, she outlived her daughter. Mary died in 1557. Elizabeth Stafford was still alive in 1558. Whatever passed between those two women in the last 20 years of Mary's life, if anything passed at all, nobody wrote it down. That was the house. A father who could survive anything and had no interest in being loved. A mother who could not be silenced and could not be helped. A brother, Henry, 3 years older, who was already showing signs of being the most gifted and least governable person in the family. And a set of unwritten rules that Mary absorbed before she was 12 years old. That the strong protect themselves. That a woman's protection depends entirely on a man's goodwill. That goodwill is not a stable substance. And that the only genuinely reliable asset a person can hold is one that has been signed over to them in law, in writing, in their own name. Hold on to that last one. She is going to spend 4 years of her life proving it. Now, the physical world she moved through was, I should say, magnificent. Because it would be a mistake to leave you with the impression of squalor. Kenninghall, in Norfolk, was the great Howard house, and her father had rebuilt it into something enormous brick, courtyards, a chapel, a long gallery, deer park running out past the windows. There was a household of well over 100 people. There was a chapel choir. There were tapestries that had come out of Flanders and plate that came out 4 times a year and stayed on the sideboard so that visitors could count it. And it was Catholic to the bone. Not thoughtfully Catholic, not devotionally Catholic, culturally, structurally, unquestioningly Catholic, in the way that the walls were brick. Mass in Latin every morning, fast days observed, saints' days marked on the household calendar and in the kitchen accounts. Her father was not a spiritual man in any sense I can identify, but he understood the old religion as the foundation of the arrangement that made him what he was, and he defended it the way a man defends the beams of his own roof. Mary was raised in that, taught in it, confirmed in it, given, along with it, an education that was better than most men of her class received, because the Howards had absorbed the new humanist fashion sufficiently to see that a well-read daughter was a more valuable daughter. She had Latin, she had French, she read, and by the standards of the 1530s she read seriously. There is no way for me to tell you exactly when the doubts started. Nobody ever can, with a conversion this quiet. But somewhere in a house that was Catholic the way brick is brick, a girl was reading, and reading is the least controllable activity ever invented. There is a woman who comes into this story now who changes the temperature of every room she enters, and I have to introduce her properly, because Mary's whole young adulthood is arranged around her. Anne Boleyn was Mary's first cousin. Their mothers were sisters well. More precisely, Anne's mother, Elizabeth Howard, was the sister of Mary's father. So Anne was a Howard on the maternal side, and a Boleyn on the paternal side, and the Boleyns were the sort of family that made the old nobility uneasy, because the Boleyns had gotten where they were entirely on merit, and everyone could still remember it. Anne's great-grandfather had been a merchant and Lord Mayor of London. 2 generations later, the family was marrying earls' daughters. In England, in that century, that was fast. Anne had spent her adolescence abroad, first in the Low Countries in the household of Margaret of Austria, then in France, where she stayed for something like 7 years in the service of Queen Claude. She came back to England around 1522, when Mary was 3 or 4 years old, and she came back finished. She spoke French like a Frenchwoman. She dressed like one. She had an opinion about religious reform, which was a thing that French court women were beginning to have, and English court women very much were not. And she had a manner every single person who described her mentions it. Friends and enemies alike, a quality of holding attention without appearing to want it. She was somewhere between 12 and 18 years older than Mary. The records disagree on Anne's birth year, and they always will. What matters is that Anne was fully adult when Mary was still a child, and that Mary grew up watching her. Now think about what Mary was actually watching, year by year, as she went from 9 to 10 to 11 to 12. She was watching a woman from her own family, not a princess, not a foreign match, not anybody's daughter of state, take the most powerful man in England and hold him at arm's length for 6 years. 6 years. The king wanted Anne in 1526 and did not marry her until 1533, and in the intervening time he broke with the Pope, destroyed his own chief minister, discarded a Spanish queen who had been at his side for 2 decades, and rewrote the constitutional relationship between England and Rome. All of it, at least in the shape it took, downstream of one woman declining to be a mistress. I want to be careful not to make that sound like a fairy tale, because Anne was also playing a game she could not stop playing, and the game killed her. But from where Mary was standing, at 11 and 12 years old, the lesson was startling, and it was very simple. A woman could refuse. Refusal, held long enough and steadily enough, was a form of power. Mary was going to test that proposition herself, later, for 21 years, and against much longer odds. Her mother, meanwhile, was refusing something else entirely. Elizabeth Stafford had served Catherine of Aragon. She had carried Catherine's train at ceremonies. She liked the Queen, believed in the Queen's cause, and considered the whole Boleyn business an obscenity dressed up in legal language. And when the pressure came on every noblewoman in England to switch her allegiance to attend the new Queen, to accept the new arrangement, to be seen doing so, the Duchess of Norfolk refused. Flatly, out loud. She was reported to be sending messages of support to Catherine. Her husband, who was Anne Boleyn's uncle and the single most invested man in the entire enterprise, was incandescent. That is very likely the specific fault line the marriage finally cracked along. Not just Bess Holland. Bess Holland was the wound. Catherine of Aragon was the politics. Elizabeth Stafford chose the losing queen for reasons of conscience, in a household run by a man for whom the phrase reasons of conscience was a synonym for professional incompetence. So when the coronation came, in the summer of 1533, the mother was not there. The daughter was. Anne Boleyn was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 1st of June 1533. She came up the river from Greenwich the Thursday before with a barge procession that ran for miles, then through the city under arches the guilds had built, then to the Abbey, and Thomas Cranmer, 4 months into the job of Archbishop of Canterbury, set the crown of St. Edward on her head. She was 6 months pregnant, and she was wearing purple, velvet, and ermine, which is the colour and the fur reserved for royalty, and she was for exactly 1,032 days, though nobody was counting yet the Queen of England. Mary was 14. She was in the Abbey, in the crowd of Howard women, in a family that had just achieved the most spectacular result in its history. Here is what I keep thinking about when I imagine her in that building. The incense, the choir, the weight of the clothes, the sheer noise of it, all of that is easy to picture, and none of it is the interesting part. The interesting part is that her mother's absence would have been extremely conspicuous. Everyone in that church knew where the Duchess of Norfolk was, and why. Mary stood among the winners, at 14, in a family triumph that was simultaneously a public humiliation of her mother, and she stood there without visible distress, because she had already learned by then that visible distress was a luxury. 3 months later, she was back at Greenwich for the christening. The baby was not the boy. Everybody had promised the king a boy. The astrologers, the physicians, the letters announcing the birth had already been written with the word prince on them, and somebody had to go back and squeeze in an extra letter. But the ceremony went ahead in full state on the 10th of September, 1533, at the Church of the Observant Friars at Greenwich, and the child was named Elizabeth. Mary Howard was in the procession. She was given the chrism cloth to carry the white cloth used in the baptism, an honour handed to a young woman of high blood as a mark of the family's standing. 14 years old, walking in state, carrying a piece of white linen in front of the whole court, behind a 2-day-old baby who was at that moment the heir to the throne of England. That baby would outlive her by 45 years and reign for 44 of them. Mary would never see a day of it. The other thing that happened in September of 1533 was that 2 young men came home from France. Her brother had been away for a year, so had the boy she was going to marry. And if you want to understand why the marriage that followed was such a strange, cold, suspended arrangement, you have to understand that the two people it actually bound together most closely were not the bride and groom. They were the groom and the bride's brother. Henry FitzRoy was born in June of 1519 in a priory in Essex to a young woman named Elizabeth Blount, who had been one of Queen Catherine's maids of honour. The surname the king gave him was not subtle: FitzRoy, son of the king. In Norman French, more or less. That is the whole announcement. He was born in the same year Mary was, or near enough that nobody can separate them. And he was, from the moment of his birth, the single most politically complicated child in England, because Catherine of Aragon by that point had produced one surviving daughter and a series of graves, and here, suddenly, was proof that the failure was not the king's. For 6 years he was kept quietly in the country. Then, in June of 1525, at Bridewell Palace, the king brought him out in front of the court and did something no English king had done in living memory. He made a 6-year-old boy Earl of Nottingham, and then, in the same ceremony, Duke of Richmond and Duke of Somerset, 2 dukedoms. Richmond had been his own father's title before Bosworth. Somerset was Beaufort, the line the Tudors came through. Every single person in that room understood the vocabulary being used. The boy was being dressed in the family's own royal history. He was given precedence over every peer in England. He was given precedence, in fact, over the king's legitimate daughter. Catherine of Aragon protested and got nowhere, and 3 of her Spanish ladies were dismissed from her household for complaining about it too loudly. Then they sent him north. This is the part of FitzRoy's life that most people skip, and I think it's the part that tells you most about him. At 6 years old, he was given a household of 250 people and installed at Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire as the nominal head of the Council of the North, the standing body that governed the northern counties, the Crown's behalf. He was not, obviously, governing anything. Grown men were doing the governing, but documents went out in his name. Petitioners came to his hall. He held courts, in the sense that a small boy sat at the head of a table while adults conducted business around him, and occasionally leaned over to tell him when to nod. He grew up as a piece of constitutional furniture, immensely valuable, immensely decorated, and never once consulted. His education was the best money could buy, and it took. John Palsgrave taught him a serious humanist scholar, the man who wrote the first real French grammar in English. Richard Croke taught him Greek, and Croke was one of the men who had brought Greek studies to Cambridge in the first place. By 10, the boy was reading Caesar and Virgil and Terence in Latin without assistance. Palsgrave wrote a letter, which survives, worrying that the household around the child was more interested in teaching him to hunt and hawk and play at being a great lord than in making him sit down with his books. It's a very recognizable complaint. Anyone who has ever tried to make a 10-year-old boy finish anything will feel a certain kinship with John Palsgrave. And at some point in the 1520s, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, came into that household as a companion, and the 2 boys became inseparable. They were about the same age. They were both extravagantly clever, and both being raised as ornaments. And in 1532, when the king went across to Calais and Boulogne for his summit with Francis I, the trip where he took Anne Boleyn with him, and effectively presented her to the French king as the next Queen of England, the 2 boys went too, and when the English party came home, FitzRoy and Surrey stayed. They spent roughly a year at the French court, living with the Dauphin and his brothers, hunting, riding, learning the manners of the most sophisticated court in Europe, and reading. It is very likely that this is where Surrey first encountered the Italian verse forms that he would later carry into English and rebuild from the ground up, which is a matter of some consequence, because what Surrey brought back and reshaped is the sonnet form that Shakespeare would use 60 years later. 3 quatrains and a couplet. That structure is Surrey's. They came home in the autumn of 1533, and in November, Mary married him. The 26th of November, 1533, at Hampton Court. She was 14, he was 14, and it was, by the standards of what these 2 people were, almost absurdly small. No tournament, no procession, no public feasting, nothing that would have appeared in a chronicle if the chroniclers had not been obliged to record it. The reason was legal, and the reason was awkward. Mary and Henry FitzRoy were related within the prohibited degrees they shared descent from Ralph Neville, 1st Earl of Westmoreland, and Joan Beaufort, which put them inside the boundary where canon law required a dispensation from Rome, in 1533. In the same year, the king had finally severed the appeal to Rome and had his own archbishop declare his first marriage void on the grounds that the Pope's dispensation in that case had been worthless. You can see the difficulty. The whole architecture of the king's new marriage rested on the argument that papal dispensations could not make lawful what God had forbidden, and here was the king's own son needing exactly such a dispensation to marry. So it was requested quietly, granted quietly, filed quietly, and the wedding was held at a scale that would attract as little comment as possible. Now the part that shaped Mary's entire adult life. They did not live together. After the ceremony, the two of them were separated and returned to their separate households, and the marriage was, by explicit intention, not consummated. The stated reason was FitzRoy's health, and beneath that a piece of medical folklore that was taken very seriously at the time. That early sexual activity weakened a young man and shortened his life. The king had watched his own elder brother Arthur marry at 15 and die at 15, 5 months later, and whatever the actual cause of Arthur's death, there was a widespread and firmly held view at court about what had contributed to it. Henry VIII was not going to lose this son the same way, so the order came down. They would be married and they would wait. I want to stop here for a moment and put you inside it, because this is the hinge of her whole life and it deserves more than a sentence. You are 14 years old. You were married this morning in a small chapel to a boy you have met a handful of times, a boy your brother loves and talks about constantly, a boy who has just come back from a year in France full of stories you have not been in. The ceremony took under an hour. There was no feast worth the name. You are now the Duchess of Richmond and Somerset, which means that in any room in England, apart from those containing the king or his daughter, you go in first. You outrank your own father. And tonight you go back to your father's house. Not because anything has gone wrong, because that is the arrangement. That is what was agreed, above your head, in rooms you have never been in. You are a duchess with no household. You are a wife who will not see her husband except at ceremonies. You have been given the highest title available to a woman in England who is not born royal, and you have been given nothing to do with it, and no income of your own, and no house of your own, and no clear idea when any of that is supposed to change. You are 14, and you are going to be in this exact position for 2 years and 8 months. Then it ends, and it ends much worse than that. So what did she actually do for the next 2 years and 8 months? The honest answer is that we know a great deal more about what he did, and the imbalance is itself the point. He was a public office. She was a title with nowhere to sit. Henry FitzRoy in those years held a collection of positions that would have been remarkable for a man of 40. He had been Lord High Admiral of England since he was 6. He was Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. Nominally, from the age of 10, the actual governing was done by deputies who wrote to him and received replies drafted by his council. He was Warden General of the marches towards Scotland. He had a household at Baynard's Castle in London, and the use of St. James's, and estates scattered across the country that had been carved out for him. And in these last years the king began using him as a working piece of the state, which is a different thing from using him as an ornament. In November of 1533, the same month he married Mary, he received Philippe de Chabot, the Admiral of France, who had come over on embassy. In 1535 he was involved in the reception of the imperial ambassador. He sat in the House of Lords. He was, at 15 and 16, being walked slowly into the role of a prince who could be sent to represent his father. And behind all of it, the question nobody would say out loud in England, but that every ambassador in London wrote home about constantly. What was the king going to do with him? The proposals that had been floated for this boy over the years tell you how open the question was. There had been talk of a Danish princess. There had been talk of a Portuguese one. Chapuis reported at one point that the king was considering making him King of Ireland outright, as a separate crown for a separate son. And in 1527, at the height of the divorce crisis, there was a suggestion, it came from Rome, which is the astonishing part, floated as a possible way out of the whole mess that FitzRoy might marry his own half-sister, Princess Mary, and the two claims could be combined and the succession settled that way. Nothing came of that, obviously, but the fact that it could be said at all, in a papal context, tells you how badly everybody wanted the problem solved and how few solutions there were. What all of it meant for the girl who had actually married him is that she was standing next to a live constitutional question. If the king legitimized his son, and after the second act of succession he had the statutory power to name him, then Mary Howard was the wife of the heir to the throne of England. If he did not, she was a young woman with a very long name and no house. They saw each other. That much is certain. They appeared together at court on ceremonial occasions, which is what the marriage had been arranged to permit. There were New Year gift exchanges, which is how these things were formally marked. They were, by all appearances, on perfectly good terms. He was her brother's dearest friend. They were the same age. They had known each other since childhood, and there is not a syllable anywhere suggesting either of them disliked the other. There are also hints, and they are only hints, that at some point one or both of them asked to be allowed to live together properly and were refused. I believe those hints, and I want to be clear that believing them is a judgment and not a fact. But consider the position from inside it. Two people of 16 or 17, lawfully married for 2 years, who see each other at official functions in front of 100 people, and then go back to separate houses on a doctor's theory about the health of young men. Neither of them chose the arrangement. Neither of them could end it. The only person who could was the king, and the king had other things on his mind in 1535. Meanwhile, she had no establishment of her own. She had no income of her own. She was living in her father's orbit, moving between Kenninghall and the London house, technically outranking every woman in England except the Queen and the King's daughters, and technically dependent on her father's household for her clothes. That is a genuinely peculiar way to spend the years between 14 and 17, and I think it explains something about the rest of her, because most people, at that age, are learning that the world will give them things. She was learning something quite different. That a title is a description of your position in a diagram, and that it has nothing whatever to do with what you can eat, or where you can sleep, or whether anybody has to listen to you. She was going to spend the next 4 years converting the diagram into land, and she was going to spend the 20 years after that refusing to trade the land back for another position in another diagram. One more thing about those 2 years and 8 months, and then we will go forward. It was in this period that she was most consistently at court, and therefore most consistently inside the household of her cousin, the Queen. Anne Boleyn's rooms in the middle 1530s were the most interesting place in England to be a young woman, and Mary was there for the last stretch of it, at exactly the age when a person's mind is being furnished. The books were in that room, the arguments were in that room, and the manuscript was going round. There is a book in the British Library, catalogued rather unromantically as additional manuscript 17,492, and it is the single best surviving window into what Mary Howard's inner life was actually like. It is a small, battered, heavily used verse miscellany, and scholars call it the Devonshire Manuscript. Picture the object first. It is not a fine presentation copy. It is a working book, about the size of a modern paperback, and the handwriting in it belongs to more than a dozen different people. Poems are copied in, then answered. Lines are altered. Someone writes a verse, and someone else writes a reply underneath it. Sometimes in the voice of the opposite sex, sometimes disagreeing, sometimes teasing. There are initials in the margins. There are little jokes. There are stanzas broken off partway through, as though the person copying was interrupted and never came back. It contains a large body of Thomas Wyatt's verse, well over 100 poems, in what is, for several of them, the earliest surviving text we have. It contains poems by Surrey, and it contains poems, some of them almost certainly original, by the women who were passing the book around. 3 of those women can be identified with reasonable confidence. One was Mary Shelton, another Howard cousin, another of Anne Boleyn's relations, a young woman whose name got attached to court gossip in the mid-1530s. One was Margaret Douglas, the king's own niece, daughter of his sister Margaret by her second marriage, and therefore a person with a genuine claim somewhere in the royal succession. And one was Mary Howard. Her initials appear in it. Her hand appears in it. There is a reasonable scholarly argument that the book may have started as hers. Now, you could look at that and see a group of well-bred young women amusing themselves with love poetry, and for 400 years that is more or less what people did see. I think that reading is badly wrong, and here is why. Consider what these 3 women had in common in the mid-1530s. Mary Shelton was in the orbit of a queen who was 2 years from the scaffold. Margaret Douglas was of royal blood in a reign where royal blood was a diagnosis rather than a privilege. Mary Howard was married to the king's son and living in her father's house with no money and no husband. Not one of them could speak freely to anyone about anything at any time. Every conversation they had was in a building full of people paid to report on them, and what they had instead was a book and a convention. Courtly love poetry came with a ready-made vocabulary for longing, for grievance, for betrayal, for waiting, for being bound to someone by an arrangement rather than a choice. If you write down that you are unhappy, that is dangerous. If you copy out a 15th century French lyric about constancy in adversity and hand it to your friend with a line altered, that is a pastime. It is the oldest trick there is. You say the thing in a form where saying it is permitted. 2 of those women found out exactly how thin that protection was. In the summer of 1536, Margaret Douglas was discovered to have secretly contracted a marriage. The man was Lord Thomas Howard Mary's uncle, the much younger half-brother of the Duke of Norfolk. They had done it privately, without the king's permission, and Margaret Douglas was at that moment, because of the wreckage of the king's own 2 marriages, arguably standing rather close to the succession. An unauthorized marriage to a Howard, in that summer of all summers, was not a romance. It was, in the reading the king instantly gave it, an attempt on the throne. They were both arrested, both sent to the Tower. Parliament passed an act specifically making it treason to marry into the royal family without permission, and made it retrospective, which tells you the mood. Lord Thomas Howard was condemned to death. He was not executed. He was left in the Tower instead, and he stayed there, and in October of 1537 he died there, of some illness nobody bothered to name precisely. He was around 25. Margaret Douglas was eventually released and eventually forgiven, and lived a long and eventful life. But while the 2 of them were locked up in separate parts of the Tower, they wrote poems to each other. And those poems, his and hers, back and forth, the real thing, written by 2 people in genuine peril, are in the Devonshire Manuscript. Somebody carried them out. Somebody copied them in. Somebody kept the book safe afterward, through the fall of the Howards, through a reign of religious terror, through everything. Nobody can prove that person was Mary. It is one of several possibilities, and the honest answer is that we do not know. But she was in that circle. Her hand is on those pages. She was close to Margaret Douglas. The man who died was her uncle, and she is the member of the group with the strongest claim to have owned the book. Draw your own conclusion. I know what I think. What I want you to take from all of this is not a claim about who owned a manuscript. It is a claim about what Mary Howard was doing with her 20s. She was reading constantly. She was in a circle of educated women who took ideas seriously, and the ideas circulating in Anne Boleyn's household in the 1530s were not only about poetry. Anne had come back from France with reformist books in her luggage, and she kept them where people could see them. She owned an English translation of the Bible at a time when owning one could be construed as heresy, and she made a point of leaving it open. She protected reformist clergy. Several of the men who would define English Protestantism over the next 20 years got their first real preferment because Anne Boleyn put their names in front of the king. Mary was in that household as a young teenager, at exactly the age when a person's mind sets. She was in a room where educated women read scripture in their own language and argued about what it meant. Her father would have been appalled if he had grasped what was happening. I am not certain he ever did. Thomas Howard's imagination did not extend to the possibility that his daughter had an interior life with load-bearing walls in it. But something was being built in there, and it would be about 15 years before anybody outside her own head found out what. That summer in the Tower sat at the tail end of a year that took nearly everything Mary had. Let me walk you through 1536 properly, because it is one of the most extraordinary 12 months in English history, and Mary Howard lost 3 people in it. It opened with a funeral. Catherine of Aragon died at Kimbolton on the 7th of January, and the King and Anne Boleyn appeared at court dressed head to foot in yellow, which people have argued about ever since mourning colour in Spain. Some say, or simple celebration, which is what most of the ambassadors present assumed. Anne was pregnant again and, with Catherine dead, finally unassailable, no living rival, no competing claim. If this child was a boy, the entire argument was over. 3 weeks later, on the 24th of January, the king went down in the tilt-yard at Greenwich, fully armoured, horse and all, and the horse came down on top of him. He was unconscious for a period, the sources report variously, and unreliably 2 hours is the figure usually given. He was 44 years old, and he had been the most physically impressive man at his own court for 25 years, and after that fall he was never the same again. The leg wound that would poison the rest of his life dates from around then. So does the change in temper that everybody noticed and nobody dared discuss. 5 days after the fall, on the day Catherine of Aragon was buried, Anne Boleyn miscarried. The fetus was far enough developed for people to identify it as male. That is the end of Anne Boleyn, and everyone at court understood it within a week, even if it took another 3 months to arrange. The arrangement, when it came fast. On the last day of April, a court musician named Mark Smeaton was taken to Thomas Cromwell's house at Stepney and questioned, and by the next morning he had confessed to adultery with the Queen. Everyone at the time, and virtually everyone since, has assumed torture. Henry Norris was arrested on May Day, then William Brereton, then Francis Weston, then, on the 2nd of May, George Boleyn, Anne's brother, and on the same day, Anne herself was taken. She was arrested at Greenwich after dinner, brought before a group of councillors, and put in a barge down the river to the Tower. The man who led that delegation, who read her the charges, and who accompanied her to the Tower, was the Duke of Norfolk, her uncle, Mary's father. The chronicles say he shook his head at her and made a tutting noise and said, "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear," as she protested her innocence. Whether he actually did that, I could not tell you. Whether it is the sort of thing he would have done, I could tell you with total confidence. He then presided over her trial, Lord High Steward, in the Great Hall of the Tower, on the 15th of May, in front of 2,000 spectators. He heard the evidence, which included the charge that she had committed incest with her own brother, a charge that essentially nobody now believes, and that a good many people at the time did not believe either. He put the question to the peers. They found her guilty, and he passed the sentence of death on his own niece, and, the reports say, he wept while he did it. 15 years earlier, in that same city, his own father had sat in the same seat, said the same words to Mary's grandfather Buckingham, and wept in the same way. 2 generations of Howard dukes, presiding over the judicial killing of their own relatives, in tears, and doing it anyway. If you want the family creed in one image, that is it. Anne Boleyn was beheaded on Tower Green on the 19th of May, 1536, by a swordsman brought over from Calais for the purpose. She was the first English queen ever executed. Mary was 17 years old, and she had spent her childhood watching that woman and learning from her, and now she watched the family absorb the loss and keep moving without breaking stride. There is one more thing about the 19th of May, and I have left it until now because of who it involves. Henry FitzRoy was there. The king's son, 17 years old, was among the men who stood on Tower Green and watched his father's second wife have her head taken off with a sword. Attendance at these things was not voluntary in any meaningful sense. The Crown wanted witnesses of rank, and the presence of the king's own son at the execution of a woman convicted of treason against the king was a statement. So on that morning, the two young people who had been married 3 years earlier at Hampton Court were both, in their different ways, standing in the wreckage of the same family. He was on the green. She was not. Women of the court were not required, and there is no record placing her there. But her cousin was the woman on the scaffold. Her father had passed the sentence, and her husband was in the crowd. 8 weeks later, she would be arranging his funeral clothes, because that is what happened next. Norfolk's other niece was already being lined up. Not immediately, Jane Seymour was married to the king 11 days after the execution, but the machinery did not so much as pause. Within a fortnight of Anne's death, her cousin Mary Shelton was back at court. The household was reorganised, and the Howards were negotiating their position with the new regime. There is one small, cold, entirely characteristic detail from those weeks that I keep with me. Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, reported that after the execution the king spoke to his son. He embraced him, and he wept, and he said something to the effect that he and his sister Mary were fortunate to have escaped that cursed and venomous woman who had planned to poison them both. That was the story the king had decided to believe, or found it convenient to say. And the boy standing there listening to his father say it was 17 years old and had about 8 weeks left to live. Henry FitzRoy died on the 23rd of July, 1536, at St. James's Palace. The contemporary word for what killed him was a consumption, or in some accounts a lingering ague. Modern opinion generally settles on pulmonary tuberculosis, which fits the reported course: a decline over some months, a cough, an apparent recovery, then a rapid collapse. He had been well enough in June to attend the opening of Parliament. By the middle of July he was dying. By the end of the month he was dead. The timing was almost unbelievably bad, from the king's point of view, and here is why. That same month, Parliament had passed the Second Act of Succession. It bastardised Elizabeth, as the First Act had bastardised Mary Tudor, and it settled the crown on the children of Jane Seymour. And then it did something no English statute had ever done. It gave the king the power to name his own successor by letters patent or by his last will, if there were no legitimate heirs. That clause had exactly one obvious purpose. It opened the door for Henry FitzRoy. The door opened in July. The boy died in July. Mary was 17. She had lost her cousin in May and her husband in July, and she had never lived with either of them in the ordinary sense, and she was now something the English legal system had not entirely made up its mind about, a widow of a marriage that had never been consummated. Then came the funeral, and the funeral was a mess. The king gave the order himself. No public ceremony. He did not want a state occasion. He did not want the country watching him bury the son he had spent 17 years advertising. He told Norfolk to have the body taken quietly into Norfolk and buried at Thetford Priory, which was a Howard mausoleum, and to keep it discreet. Norfolk took the instruction literally, which was his first mistake, and delegated the arrangements, which was his second. The body was put in a lead coffin. The coffin was put on a cart. The cart was covered with straw, and it went up the road to Thetford with 2 attendants riding alongside. No hearse, no banners, no procession of mourners. A Duke of England, the king's own son, going home under a load of straw. People were appalled. Word got around, as word does, and the king, who had ordered exactly this, was furious that it had been done exactly this way, and turned on Norfolk publicly, and Norfolk spent months writing letters, trying to explain that he had done what he was told. Read those letters and you will find a very old man for once genuinely at a loss. He had spent his entire career being able to read the king. This time he had read him correctly, done as instructed, and been punished for it anyway, and he could not work out what he was supposed to have done differently. The answer, of course, is that there was nothing. The king needed somebody to have made a mistake, because otherwise the mistake was his own. Norfolk went into disfavour. He was not at court that autumn. He was at Kenninghall, out of the way, when the north of England rose in the Pilgrimage of Grace in October, and it was that rebellion and his brutal, effective suppression of it over the following winter that eventually put him back in the king's good graces. He hanged people in their own villages, in numbers, as an example, and it worked, and he was forgiven. And while her father was buying his way back into favour with Rope, Mary was working out what she was going to live on. Here is the legal position she found herself in, and I'll keep it as clear as I can, because the technicality is the whole story. Under English common law, a widow was entitled to dower life interest in a portion of her late husband's landed estate, conventionally a third, which supported her until she died or remarried. This was not charity, and it was not a favour. It was a property right, and it was one of the very few property rights an English woman genuinely held in her own name. It was the entire mechanism by which the legal system prevented widows from becoming destitute. Henry FitzRoy had held enormous estates, 2 dukedoms worth, plus grants of monastic land, plus the offices. Mary's dower out of that would have made her a substantially wealthy woman for life. The Crown refused to pay it. The argument the king's officers made was that the marriage had never been consummated, and that an unconsummated marriage did not entitle the widow to dower, which, if you have been listening, you will notice is remarkable because the marriage had not been consummated on the king's own explicit instruction. The Crown had ordered the couple to live apart, and was now using the fact that they had obeyed as grounds for keeping the money. She was 17, going on 18. Her father was in disgrace and preoccupied with saving himself. Her husband was dead. Her mother was in Hertfordshire, estranged, penniless, and had no reason on earth to help her. And the counterparty in this dispute was the King of England. Most people fold at that point. There is no shame in folding at that point. What Mary did instead was start writing letters, and she kept writing them for 3.5 years. The letters that survive are fragmentary, but they are enough to show you the method. There is no pleading in them. There is no weeping, no invocation of her sorrows, no appeal to pity, and pity was the conventional register, the expected posture, the thing a young widow was supposed to perform. She does not perform it. What she does instead is argue. She sets out her legal position. She refers to precedent. She addresses the consummation point directly and states that dower does not depend on it. She asks, repeatedly and courteously and without ever once going away, to have her case heard on its merits. She wrote to Cromwell. She wrote to councillors. She got other people to write on her behalf. She kept the file open, month after month, year after year, in a court where the surest way to lose a claim was to let everyone stop thinking about it. And in the meantime she had to eat. So she sold her jewellery, the pieces she had been given at the marriage, the gifts that had come with the title, the physical evidence that she was the Duchess of Richmond and Somerset. She sold them one at a time to raise money to live on, which means that somewhere in London, in the late 1530s, there was a goldsmith who could tell approximately how badly things were going for the king's daughter-in-law, by which piece she brought in that month. I find that detail almost unbearable, and I also think she would have been irritated by anyone finding it unbearable. She was not selling her jewels in tragic circumstances. She was liquidating assets to fund litigation. Those are 2 different activities, and she was clear about which one she was doing. There was, of course, an obvious alternative available to her, and people kept pointing it out. She could remarry. She was young. She was extremely well born. She held a duchess's title, and crucially, even the disputed dower claim made her an attractive proposition, because a husband would take over the claim and press it with the weight of his own name behind him. Every practical consideration pointed the same direction. And in 1538, a specific proposal came forward from the highest possible quarter. Thomas Cromwell suggested that Mary should marry Thomas Seymour. Understand what that meant. Thomas Seymour was the brother of Queen Jane, and Jane had by then delivered the boy. Prince Edward was born in October 1537, and Jane died 12 days later, and the Seymour brothers were now the uncles of the heir to the throne. They were rising, and they were going to keep rising. Thomas Seymour was handsome, energetic, ambitious, and by every account extremely good company, and 30 years later people were still describing him with a mixture of admiration and alarm. A marriage between the Duchess of Richmond and the prince's uncle would have knitted the Howard and Seymour interests together at exactly the moment both were reaching for the same ground. Her father was, at various points, prepared to entertain it. Cromwell pushed it. It made sense to nearly everybody. It did not happen. And the reason it did not happen appears, in the sources we have, to be her brother. Surrey loathed the Seymours. Not disagreed with loathed, in a personal, aristocratic, unreasoning way that he never made the slightest effort to conceal. The Seymours were, in his view, new men. Their grandfather had been a knight of no particular consequence. They had arrived at the top of the kingdom because their sister had caught the king's eye, and now they walked around the council chamber as though they belonged there. And Surrey, whose family had been at Agincourt and Flodden and Bosworth, who could recite his own descent for 300 years without pausing for breath, found the whole thing physically offensive. The idea of his sister in a Seymour bed was, to him, close to defilement. What we know about the conversations between brother and sister on this subject comes to us through a very compromised channel, and I'll be honest with you about that. It comes largely through the depositions taken in 1546, when everybody involved had a reason to shape what they said. But the substance of it, as recorded, is that Surrey told Mary that if she was going to be put near the Seymours at all, she should be doing something far more useful. She should be working on the king directly, becoming the person he confided in, and turning that access to the family's advantage. We will come back to that conversation. We are going to stand in the room where it gets repeated. For now, the marriage did not happen, and Mary went back to her letters. The breakthrough came in 1539, and it came on the legal merits, which is the part I find genuinely satisfying. The question of whether dower depended on consummation was referred for an authoritative opinion. Cromwell put it to Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer considered it, and came back with the answer Mary had been asserting in her own letters for 3 years. The validity of a marriage does not rest on consummation, and the rights that flow from a valid marriage therefore do not either. She had been right. She had been right the whole time, and she had said so, in writing, over and over, to men who had every reason to hope she would get tired. Early in 1540, the crown gave way. She was granted an income and a settlement of lands, a good deal of it out of the recently dissolved monasteries. It was not everything she had claimed. It was not paid all at once. But it was hers, in her own name, for her own life, and it was enough to live on properly. She was 20 or 21 years old. She had taken on the crown of England in a property dispute, on her own, without a husband or a functioning family behind her, and after 3.5 years of correspondence she had made it pay. There is a thing that happens to people who win a fight like that in their early 20s. It fixes something. She had now personally tested the proposition that the law, applied patiently and in writing, could compel even the king, and she had found that it could. For the rest of her life, whenever anyone offered her security in exchange for control, she would have this to compare it against. She never sold another jewel, and she never took another husband. On a freezing morning at the beginning of January, 1540, a party of English noblewomen waited on Blackheath, outside Greenwich, in tents that had been put up on the frozen grass, to receive a German princess none of them had met. Mary Howard was among them. She was newly solvent, newly independent, and back at court for the first time in years, in a role that had nothing to do with her father. She was there as the Duchess of Richmond, one of the highest-ranking women in England, doing what a woman of that rank did. The princess was Anne of Cleves, and the reception on Blackheath was magnificent, and the marriage was already dead. The king had gone down to Rochester a few days earlier, in disguise, to surprise his bride in the romantic manner of the chivalric literature he had grown up on, and it had gone catastrophically. She did not recognize him, because she had no reason to, and she was watching a bull baiting out of the window at the time, and by every account she was politely baffled by the large elderly stranger who burst into her chamber and tried to embrace her. He left the room, changed into his proper clothes, came back, and the damage was done. He married her anyway on the 6th of January, because the diplomatic situation gave him no choice. and then he spent 6 months looking for a way out, and the man who had arranged the whole thing was Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell fell in June, arrested at the council table in front of everybody, and the man who is said to have stepped forward and torn the garter badge off his collar was the Duke of Norfolk. That is very likely too neat to be literally true, and it is exactly the sort of moment the Howards attracted. Cromwell was attainted without trial and beheaded on the 28th of July, 1540. Thomas Howard had wanted that man dead for a decade, and he finally got it. And the very same day Cromwell's head came off, the king married Catherine Howard. She was another of Norfolk's nieces, daughter of his younger brother Edmund, which made her Mary's first cousin, just as Anne Boleyn had been. She was somewhere between 16 and 20. She had been raised, not very carefully, in the household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk at Lambeth and Horsham, in a crowded, loosely supervised establishment where young gentlewomen and young gentlemen were in and out of the same rooms at hours nobody was really monitoring. She was never crowned. That is worth saying plainly, because it gets stated wrongly constantly. There was no coronation. There was a wedding at Oatlands, quietly, and then she was simply presented as queen. The king was 49 and delighted and behaving, according to the ambassadors, like a much younger and much sillier man. He called her his rose without a thorn. He commissioned a medal with that phrase on it. The Howards were back at the very centre of everything, for the second time in a decade, on the same mechanism. Mary watched this happen from a position she had never occupied before. She was financially independent of it. She had her own lands. Whatever happened to the family now, she was not going to starve because of it. And I think that changes what a person sees. When you need a thing to work out, you look at it hopefully. When you do not, you can look at it accurately. It took 15 months. In the autumn of 1541, while the king was on progress in the north, a man named John Lascelles went to Archbishop Cranmer with a story his sister had told him. His sister had served in the Dowager Duchess's household at Lambeth, and she said that before her marriage the Queen had been involved with her music master, Henry Manox, and then in a full sexual relationship with a gentleman of the household named Francis Dereham, and that Dereham had called her his wife, and she had called him her husband. Cranmer put it in writing and left the letter for the king to find during Mass at Hampton Court on the 1st of November. The king's first reaction was that it must be false. Then the investigation started, and it did not stop. Dereham was arrested and, under questioning, gave them something far worse. He named Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, and said that Culpeper had displaced him in the Queen's affections after the marriage. Letters were found. There is one in Catherine's own hand, to Culpeper, and it is the single most damaging piece of paper in the whole business. And it is also, when you read it, the letter of a very young person who is frightened and in over her head. Culpeper and Dereham were executed in December. Catherine Howard was attainted by Parliament and beheaded on Tower Green on the 13th of February, 1542, along with Lady Rochford, who had carried the messages. She was executed within sight of where Anne Boleyn had died 5.5 years earlier. 2 first cousins. Same family, same king, same green. And her father survived it. Again. The way Norfolk survived it was by writing a letter to the king in which he abandoned every member of his family who had been anywhere near the business. He described his niece's conduct in terms of complete moral revulsion. He distanced himself from the Lambeth household entirely. He asked the king not to allow the family's disgrace to weigh against a servant who had always been loyal. Several of his relations, including the Dowager Duchess, went to the Tower. Norfolk went home to Kenninghall and waited it out, and was back at the council table within a year. Mary saw all of that at close range. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to turn her father into a monster, and he was something more ordinary and more useful to understand. Thomas Howard was not a sadist. He did not enjoy any of this. He was a man who had constructed his entire personality around a single principle: the family survives, and the head of the family survives first, and who had followed that principle so far and for so long that there was no longer anything else in him. He would have found the accusation of coldness genuinely bewildering. He had done what had to be done. He had done it every time. That was the job. His daughter drew the opposite conclusion from the same evidence, and she drew it silently, and she never once said so to his face. Because in these years, the other thing was happening. The religious ground in England through the 1540s was not stable, and it did not move in one direction. The break with Rome had happened in the early 30s, and the monasteries had gone through the late 30s, and if you had been watching only that, you would have assumed England was becoming a Protestant country. But in 1539, Parliament passed the Act of 6 Articles, which reaffirmed transubstantiation, clerical celibacy, private masses and auricular confession, and attached savage penalties to denying them. Denying the real presence in the sacrament carried burning, not imprisonment, burning. So the position for anyone with reformist convictions in England between 1539 and the death of the king was as follows. The Bible was legally available in English, at least for a while. The Pope was gone, the monasteries were gone, and if you said out loud, in a room with the wrong person in it, what you actually believed about the Mass, you could be taken out and burned alive for it. That is the atmosphere Mary Howard's faith formed in. We do not know exactly when she stopped being a Catholic. Nobody ever does with a change like this, including the person it happens to. There was no dramatic conversion, no moment, no confrontation with her father. What there was, over perhaps 15 years, was a woman reading scripture in her own language, and the reformist writing that came with it inside a circle of educated women where those texts were normal, and gradually arriving somewhere her whole family regarded as heresy, and saying nothing about it for years. I want to defend that silence for a moment, because our instinct is to read concealment as cowardice, and I do not think it was. There was one place in England in those years where a woman could think out loud, more or less, and Mary was close enough to it to have been burned by it. Catherine Parr married the king in July of 1543, and she was the 6th wife and the only one of the 6 with a genuine intellectual life of her own. She wrote books. She published them, the first English woman to publish original prose in English under her own name. Her privy chamber in the middle 1540s functioned as something between a household and a seminar. There were sermons, there were readings, there were books coming in from the continent that were, depending on which month you asked and which counsellor you asked, either edifying or capital. The women around her were the reformist end of the English aristocracy. Catherine Brandon, Duchess of Suffolk, Anne Stanhope, who was married to Edward Seymour, the Queen's own sister, Anne Herbert. Mary Howard's name is not in the core of that group in any source I would stake anything on, but she was a duchess in her 20s, at court, holding exactly those opinions, related to half the people involved. She was in the building, and in the summer of 1546, Stephen Gardiner and the Conservatives came very close to destroying the whole thing, and they were prepared to take it apart from the bottom up. The warrant for Catherine Parr's own arrest was drawn up. The story, and it is a good one, and probably substantially true, is that a copy of it was dropped in a corridor, that somebody brought it to her, and that she went to the king that evening and told him she only ever argued with him about religion so that he might correct her, and so that the debate might distract him from the pain in his leg. And he was so pleased with the answer that when the Lord Chancellor arrived the next day with 40 guards to arrest her, the king called him a knave and a fool and sent him away. A dropped piece of paper and one very good sentence, delivered at exactly the right moment. That was the whole margin, at the top of the kingdom, for a woman with opinions. Further down there was no margin at all. That same summer, a gentlewoman named Anne Askew was burned at Smithfield. She was well educated, in her mid-20s, and she had been arrested for denying transubstantiation. Before they burned her, they took her to the Tower and racked her, which was flatly illegal, for a woman and for a gentlewoman both, and which the lieutenant of the Tower refused to continue. So 2 members of the Privy Council took off their gowns and turned the handles themselves. What they wanted from her were names. They wanted the reformist women around the Queen, and through them, the Queen. She gave them nothing. She was so badly broken by the rack that she had to be carried to Smithfield and burned sitting in a chair because she could not stand. That happened while Mary Howard was alive, at court, and quietly holding exactly the opinions Anne Askew died for. Silence, in that year, was not cowardice. Silence was a technique. Mary had learned it in her father's house, watching her mother demonstrate at length and in writing what happens to a woman who says everything she thinks in a world with no mechanism for hearing it. She kept her mouth shut for the better part of 2 decades, and she kept her books, and she waited. Let me tell you about her brother now, properly, because so far he has been a name at the edge of the story, and by the end of tonight he is going to be the thing everything turns on. Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, was born around 1516 or 1517. Earl of Surrey was a courtesy title. He was the Duke's heir, not a peer in his own right, which meant that legally he was a commoner, and that detail is going to matter enormously in about 6 pages. He was, by common consent then and since, brilliant. He read Latin and Italian and French. He translated 2 books of the Aeneid into English and, in doing it, essentially invented blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter, the line that Marlowe and Shakespeare and Milton would all build on. He took the Italian sonnet and rebuilt its architecture into the 3 quatrains and a couplet shape that English poets have used ever since. When he was imprisoned at Windsor in his early 20s, he wrote a poem looking back on the years he had spent in that castle as a boy with Henry FitzRoy, and it is one of the first genuinely personal, genuinely elegiac poems in the English language. It opens by addressing the prison itself and the walls he had once been happy inside. He was 21 when he wrote that. His friend had been dead a year. He was also, and there is no way around this, extremely difficult. In 1542 he was in the Fleet prison for challenging another courtier to a duel. In 1543 he was arrested again after a night in London during which he and some friends went through the streets, breaking windows with a stone bow, a crossbow that fires stones, and, according to the complaints, doing it in Lent, and doing it to the houses of respectable citizens, and eating meat in Lent as well, which in the year of the 6 Articles was not a joke. He wrote a poem afterwards defending himself, in which he explained that the broken windows had been a kind of prophetic reproach to a sinful city. The city was not persuaded. He went back to prison. There is a version of Surrey where all of this is charming. I do not think it was. I think he was a man of extraordinary gifts who had never in his life encountered a consequence he could not have removed by mentioning his father's name, and who had therefore never developed the internal machinery that most people build by their mid-20s. He was capable of the most delicate imaginable attention on a page, and almost none of it in a room. And he had one conviction that ran deeper than any other, deeper than religion, deeper than loyalty to the king. The Howards were the first family in England. Blood was the only legitimate basis for rank, and the men rising around him were vermin. He said it constantly. He said it in front of witnesses. He said, at various points and in various forms, that when the king died, the Howards should govern, that new men should not be allowed near the young prince, and this is one of the phrases that came back to bury him, that his family was more fit to rule than the men who had appointed themselves to it. He was, to be clear, saying this about the Seymours, the Dudleys, the Pagets, the Riches, every one of whom was in the room when the king died, and Surrey was not. His military career was real, which is the part people forget. He served in Scotland. He served in France, and in 1545 the king made him Lieutenant General of the English forces at Boulogne, which was a serious command. He was 28. He took it seriously. He wanted very badly to be a great captain. And then, in January of 1546, at St. Etienne outside Boulogne, he attacked a French force and it went wrong. The English were driven back. Casualties were not enormous, but several gentlemen were killed, and the retreat was disorderly. And for a commander whose entire authority rested on his name rather than his record, the manner of it mattered more than the numbers. Reports went back to England. In March, the king replaced him with Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. Read Surrey's letters from that spring, and you can watch a man losing his footing in real time. He is defending himself. He is explaining. He is asking his sister and his father to speak for him. He wants a new command. He is not getting one. And back in England, the ground had shifted under his feet while he was away. By the middle of 1546, the king was visibly dying. He was 55. He weighed, by the estimates people make from his armour, something close to 30 stone. The ulcerated leg had to be dressed and drained. He could not manage stairs and was carried through his own palaces in a chair. His temper had become genuinely dangerous. He had signed a warrant for the arrest of his own wife that summer, over religion, and then changed his mind, and Catherine Parr had saved herself by going to him and saying that she only ever argued theology with him in order to be instructed. The prince was 8 years old. Every single person of consequence in England now understood that the real question was not whether the king would die, but what shape the regency would take, and that whoever was standing closest to the boy when it happened would hold England for a decade. The Reform Party had one enormous advantage. Edward Seymour was the prince's uncle. Blood, proximity, and the child's own affection. Around him gathered the men who wanted the religious settlement pushed further, and John Dudley and William Paget, who was the king's secretary and who controlled what the king saw and signed. The Conservative Party had the Duke of Norfolk, who was 73 and had been at the centre of English government for 40 years, and his son could not stop talking. Surrey's behaviour through the second half of 1546 reads like a man walking into traffic while explaining why he has the right of way. He was heard to say that if his father were given the governance of the prince, no man would dare oppose it. He was heard on the subject of the Seymours at length and with contempt, when his father, who could still read a room better than anyone alive, proposed a set of intermarriages between the Howards and the Seymours to diffuse the whole thing, including, once again, a match between Mary and Thomas Seymour Surrey opposed it furiously. Norfolk was trying to buy insurance. His son thought insurance was beneath them. Then Surrey did the thing that gave his enemies what they had been waiting for. He changed his coat of arms. The Howard arms already carried a great deal, including, from Flodden, an augmentation showing the Scottish lion. What Surrey added, in the autumn of 1546, were arms attributed to Edward the Confessor. Now, he had an argument. The Howards descended from the Mowbrays, and the Mowbrays had been granted the right to bear the Confessor's arms in the 14th century, and Surrey had taken advice on it from at least one herald. There is a genuine case that what he did was defensible in the strict technical law of heraldry. But nobody in December of 1546 was interested in the strict technical law of heraldry. What his enemies saw, and what they made sure the dying king saw, was the heir of the Howards putting royal arms on his shield in the last weeks of a reign, while the succession hung on a child. The man who brought the formal accusation was Sir Richard Southwell. That is the detail that gives the whole thing its taste. Southwell was not a stranger. He was a Norfolk man, from Surrey's own county, and he had known Surrey since they were boys. They had grown up in the same circles, and in December he went to the council and said that he knew things about the Earl of Surrey that touched the king's safety. Surrey's response was entirely in character and entirely useless. He demanded to fight him. He asked to be allowed trial by combat, in his shirt, against Southwell, and offered to prove the accusation false with his body, as a gentleman. The council declined. It was 1546. Nobody was going to settle a treason charge with a duel in a field. On the 12th of December, 1546, Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, was arrested and walked through the streets of London to the Tower, which was itself a piece of theatre a nobleman would normally have gone by river, out of sight. They took him past the crowds on purpose. His father was arrested the same day, and the investigators went looking for people who could tell them what the Howards had said in private. There were two obvious candidates. One was his father's mistress, Bess Holland, who had lived inside that family for 20 years and heard everything. The other was his sister, so here we are. Back where we started tonight, and now you can see the whole thing that walks into the room with her. She is 27. She has been a widow for 10 years, and she has spent most of them fighting the crown for her own money and winning. Her mother is alive and estranged, and has been telling anyone who will listen for 15 years that this family destroys the people inside it. Her cousin Anne died on the Green. Her cousin Catherine died on the Green. Her uncle Thomas died in the Tower. Her husband was carried to his grave under straw. Her father has personally condemned 2 members of his own family to death and survived both times by producing exactly the testimony the Crown required. And now the Crown requires testimony, and it has come to her. You are in a room in Westminster in December. You have known since the arrests that this would happen 3 days, perhaps 4, of knowing. Across the table are men you have known your whole adult life. Some of them have been guests in your father's house. They are courteous. That is the part nobody prepares you for. Nobody shouts at you. Nobody threatens you in any way you could later describe to another person and be believed. They simply ask you, in reasonable voices, what your brother said to you, and they wait, and the clerk's pen is already resting on the paper, and the silence goes on for exactly as long as you let it go on. And you understand, because you have been reading rooms like this one since you were 9 years old, that they already have what they need from other mouths, and that the only real question on the table now is which side of this you are going to be standing on when it is over. She talked. The depositions from December 1546 survive, and what Mary gave the council was detailed, and it was damaging, and it was not, so far as anyone has ever been able to demonstrate, a lie. She described the family's politics. She described her brother's contempt for the new men, and his conviction that the Howards should hold the regency. She described his fury at the proposed Seymour marriages, and she described the conversation about the king. According to her deposition, Surrey had told her that since she was going to be pushed at the court anyway, she should aim higher than a Seymour. She should make herself agreeable to the king himself. She should become the person he turned to, the way Anne Boleyn had been, and use that influence for the family, and, the record has it, she should be prepared to play the game as their cousins had played it. She told the council that she had refused. She said she had answered that she would rather cut her own throat. Bess Holland was deposed in the same investigation, and gave the council a great deal about Norfolk, his complaints about the king, his views on the men around him, things said at his own table over 20 years. And the 2 women's evidence together, put beside the heraldry and Southwell's accusation, and Surrey's own recorded conversations, was more than sufficient. Now, I said at the start of tonight that we would come back to the question of what she was doing in that room, and I want to give you an honest answer rather than a satisfying one. There are 3 readings, and all 3 have serious people behind them. The first is that she was broken, that the machinery of a Tudor treason investigation was overwhelming, that she was a woman alone facing the Privy Council with her father and brother already in the Tower and no protector anywhere, and that she said what was required because there was no version of that room in which she did not. The second is that she was saving herself, deliberately and coldly, that she had watched her father do precisely this twice, to Anne and to Catherine, and had learned the technique from the master, and applied it when her turn came. The third, and this is the one I find myself circling back to, is that both of those are true and neither of them is the main thing. Because look at what she actually said. She did not invent a plot. Every element in her deposition is consistent with what Surrey had been saying, loudly, in public, to anyone in earshot, for a year. The council did not need her to fabricate anything. They needed a witness who could confirm from inside the family what the family had been saying. And she gave them that, and she also gave them, in the same breath, the sentence about her own refusal, the sentence that put on the record, permanently, that when her brother proposed to sell her to a dying man for the family's advantage, she had told him no. She had spent 10 years and 3.5 years of litigation establishing that she was not property, and her brother, in a private room, had proposed to spend her anyway. I do not think that makes it a revenge. I think it makes it something colder and sadder than revenge. I think she was asked what her family was, and she answered the question accurately, and she had known the answer since she was 15 years old. She was not charged. She was not held. She went home. Surrey was tried at the Guildhall on the 13th of January 1547, and because he was legally a commoner, He was tried before a jury rather than by his peers. He defended himself for most of a day and, by the accounts we have, defended himself extremely well. He argued the heraldry point in detail. He attacked Southwell's credibility, and at moments he had the room. It made no difference. The jury convicted him. There is a story that they hesitated for hours and were sent back. He was beheaded on Tower Hill on the 19th of January 1547. He was around 30 years old. He left 5 children, the eldest of them about 11. Almost nothing he wrote had been published in his lifetime. 15 years after his death, a printer named Richard Tottle brought out a collection of English verse. It is usually called Tottle's Miscellany, and it opened with Surrey. That book went through edition after edition, and it is the channel through which the English Renaissance lyric reached the generation that included Shakespeare. The blank verse, the sonnet shape, the plain personal register. All of it comes down the pipe from a man who was executed at 30 for the arms on his shield. His father was next. Norfolk was attainted by Act of Parliament, which meant no trial at all, and the attainder passed on the 27th of January. The execution was set for the following morning, and in the early hours of the 28th of January, 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall. The council sat on the news for 3 days while they arranged the transfer of power, and in among the arrangements, somebody made the decision not to open the reign of a 9-year-old king by beheading the Premier Duke of England on a warrant signed by a dead man. Norfolk was not released. He was left in the Tower, attainted, stripped of everything, and he stayed there for 6.5 years. But he was alive. Mary's father survived because the king died 12 hours too early. Her brother did not, because he had been 9 days too slow. That is not a moral. That is just the arithmetic of that January. In the spring of 1547, 5 children arrived at Reigate. Reigate Castle, in Surrey, was a Howard property, and it is where Mary was living, and the 5 children were her brothers. Thomas, who was 11, and who was now, in every sense that had not been taken away by the attainder, the head of the family. Henry, who was 7, and 3 girls, Jane and Catherine and Margaret. They were not orphans. Their mother, Frances de Vere, was very much alive, a young widow in her late 20s, and she would eventually remarry and live another 30 years. But the family's estates had been confiscated. Their grandfather was in the Tower under sentence of death. Their father's head had come off 9 weeks earlier, and there was very little for a widowed countess without land to do about any of it. Mary had money. That is the plain reason it was Mary. She had the dower she had spent 3.5 years extracting from the crown, in her own name, unaffected by the attainder, and she was therefore the only adult in that entire family with an independent income. The council granted her custody and voted an allowance for the children's upkeep and education. And the boy king or the men writing in his name, though the note is in the register, recorded that there was no better place for them to be brought up. Think about the shape of what she agreed to. She had, 6 weeks earlier, given the testimony that helped kill their father. She now took in his children and raised them. I have gone back and forth on how to read that for a long time, and I have stopped trying to make it resolve. I think it is possible to believe every word you said, and still find that the consequences of saying it are things you will spend the rest of your life carrying. I think she looked at 5 children whose family had eaten itself, and did the only useful thing available to her, which was to make sure they did not grow up the way she had. And then she did something with that household that I do not think anybody in England expected. Around 1548, she engaged a tutor. His name was John Fox. He was about 30, a Lincolnshire man, a fellow of Magdalen College, Oxford, who had resigned his fellowship rather than take holy orders under terms he could not accept, and he was at that point a poor, unplaced, uncompromising Protestant scholar with a wife and no prospects. 30 years later, he would be the most widely read author in the English language after the translators of the Bible. His book of the sufferings of the Reformed martyrs, everyone calls it the Book of Martyrs, though that is not what he called it, went into English parish churches by order and was read aloud in them for generations. It shaped how the English understood themselves for 300 years. In 1548, he was nobody, and the Duchess of Richmond hired him to teach the grandsons of the Duke of Norfolk. Now, put those two facts side by side. The Howards were the most prominent Catholic house in England. Norfolk was in the Tower, partly because the Reform Party had wanted him out of the way, and his daughter took his heir, aged 12, and handed him to a man who would spend his life writing the definitive Protestant account of the English Church. She never said a word about it that anyone recorded. She did not have to. Everyone in England who mattered could read a household appointment. That is the closest thing to a public statement Mary Howard ever made in her life, and she made it with a hiring decision. The years at Reigate are, I think, the best years she had. There is no drama in them, which is exactly why they are the best years she had. She ran her estates. That was real work, and she did it herself. Accounts, tenancies, leases, the correspondence with lawyers that had by now become second nature. She had learned property law the hard way, and she never stopped using it. She oversaw the children's education, and it was a serious education. Latin, Greek, scripture. There was more than one scholar in that household. The Dutch physician and humanist Hadrianus Junius was there for a period as well. This was not a nursery. It was closer to a small college with children in it. She went to court rarely. The court of Edward VI had become a place where women had very little to do, run by counsellors on behalf of a boy, with the religious tone getting sterner every year. She had no need of it and no appetite for it, and for the first time since she was 10 years old, she could say what she believed out loud. The Edwardian Reformation was fast. Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer came in 1549 in English, and a further and more decisively Protestant version in 1552. The 6 articles were repealed. Images came out of the churches. The Mass became the communion. Everything Mary had been reading privately for 20 years was now the law of England. I want to sit with that for a second, because it is a strange thing to have happened to you, and I do not think it is a straightforwardly happy one. When you have kept something secret for 20 years, the secret becomes part of how you are built. Having it suddenly become ordinary, permitted, official, unremarkable does not simply feel like relief. There is a kind of vertigo in it. The thing that cost you so much to protect turns out, in the end, to be safe, and you are left holding all the habits of concealment with nothing left to conceal. She kept the habits. She would need them again in 5 years. Edward VI died on the 6th of July, 1553, at 15 years old. There was an attempt to put Jane Grey on the throne, and it collapsed in 9 days, and Mary Tudor came into London at the beginning of August to genuine popular acclaim. And one of the first things she did was open the Tower. Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, walked out of the Tower of London on the 3rd of August, 1553, at the age of 80. Having gone in 6.5 years earlier under sentence of death, he was restored. The attainder was reversed. The dukedom came back. The lands came back. He presided as Lord High Steward at another treason trial that autumn. He was, right to the end, useful, and he went home to Kenninghall and died there on the 25th of August, 1554, in his own bed, aged 81. Nobody recorded whether his daughter was with him. Nobody recorded whether she went to the funeral, and there is nothing in any surviving letter to tell us what passed between those two after 1546, or whether anything passed at all. What we do know is what she did next, and it is this: nothing. She did not contest the will. She did not petition for anything. She had her own lands, and she had had them for 14 years, and she did not need a single thing from her father's estate, which was the entire point of the fight she had won at 21. The 11-year-old boy she had taken in at Reigate was now 18, and he was the 4th Duke of Norfolk, and by then the fires had started. Queen Mary had come to the throne intending to undo everything. She was 37 years old, and she had spent her entire adult life being told that her mother's marriage was invalid, that she herself was illegitimate, and that the faith her mother had died in was error. She had been forced to sign a document admitting all of it. Nothing about her reign makes sense without that. The restoration of Catholicism came in stages, and then in 1555 the burnings began. John Rogers went first, at Smithfield, in February, Then it did not stop. Over roughly 3.5 years, somewhere close to 300 people were burned in England for heresy. Bishops Ridley and Latimer at Oxford in October 1555, Thomas Cranmer at the same place in March 1556, the man who had crowned Anne Boleyn and who had baptized Elizabeth, and who had, 20 years earlier, given the legal opinion that won Mary Howard her dower. He recanted several times under pressure, and then at the last moment in the university church he took it all back and said he would burn first the hand that had signed the recantations. And he did. Most of the people who died were not bishops. They were weavers and apprentices and farmers and housewives. Several were blind, several were very old. At least one gave birth at the stake. John Fox was not among them, because Fox left. He got out of England in 1554 with his pregnant wife, and spent the reign in Strasbourg and Frankfurt and Basel, working as a printer's corrector and collecting, letter by letter and account by account, the names and the circumstances of everybody who was burning at home. That is where the book came from. It is not a work of imagination. It is a work of collection, assembled in exile by a man who had been sitting in a Surrey schoolroom 4 years earlier, teaching Greek to somebody's nephews. Mary Howard stayed. She was in her mid-30s. She held, and had held for 20 years, precisely the convictions people were being burned for. And she was the daughter of the 3rd Duke of Norfolk and the aunt of the 4th, and the Howards were now the great Catholic family of a Catholic reign, restored, prominent, and entirely in favour. Nobody came for her. Partly that is the protection of the name. Partly it is that the burnings, for all their horror, fell overwhelmingly on people without protection, on the poor, on the obscure, on those who had said something in a market or an alehouse and been reported by a neighbour. And partly, I think, it is the simplest reason of all. There was nothing to charge her with, because she had never said anything. She did not recant. There is no record anywhere of Mary Howard renouncing anything, signing anything, or making any public profession of the old faith. And in a reign that took confession extremely seriously, and that produced a great deal of paper, that absence is not nothing. She also did not speak. She did not protest. She did not shelter anyone that we know of. She did not write. She went quiet, the way she had gone quiet at 15, and at 20, and at 27, and she waited it out. I am not going to dress that up as heroism, because it was not, and I am not going to call it cowardice either, because there is a category the word cowardice does not reach. She had learned, in a house that taught it very thoroughly, that there is a difference between not saying a thing and saying the opposite of it. Her mother had said everything and been broken. Her brother had said everything and been killed. Her father had said whatever was required and outlived them all and became, in the process, a man his own daughter could not look at. She found the 4th position, and she held it for 30 years, and the whole cost of holding it was that nobody ever quite knew her, including, I suspect, the people she lived with. She died in December of 1557, the 9th by most accounts. There was an influenza epidemic in England in those years, and it was severe. It ran through 1557 and into 1558, and it killed an enormous number of people, in the countryside particularly, and the death rate in some parishes in those 2 years was the worst England would see between the plague and the plague. Queen Mary's government was, at the time, more worried about it than about anything else. There is no record of what took Mary Howard. There is no record of where exactly she was, or who was in the room, or whether she said anything. She was about 38 years old. She was buried at Framlingham, in Suffolk, in the church of St. Michael, and she was buried beside her husband. He had been at Thetford Priory since 1536, since the cart and the straw, and there is a small piece of business attached to that which I think is worth a minute, because it is the last thing Mary's father ever really tried to build. Thetford was the Howard Mausoleum. It had been a Cluniac priory since the 12th century, and generations of the family were in the ground there, and when the dissolution came for the greater houses at the end of the 1530s, Norfolk went to considerable lengths to save it. He proposed converting it into a secular college, keep the buildings, keep the graves, change the legal category, drop the monks. He put the case to the king personally. He had, at that moment, more credit with Henry VIII than almost any man in England. He was refused. Thetford was suppressed in 1540, like everything else, and the buildings came down, so the family had to move its dead. They took the tombs out and carried them the 20-odd miles east to Framlingham, to the parish church of St. Michael, where the chancel was rebuilt to receive them. FitzRoy's monument was reassembled there, a large chest tomb, richly carved, with scenes from Genesis running around the sides. It is still standing. You can walk in and look at it any day the church is open. I like that the one thing Thomas Howard could not talk the king out of was the destruction of the place where he intended to be buried. And I like that his daughter, who spent her life refusing to trade in the family's currency, ended up under the same roof as the whole lot of them anyway. So the arrangement that had governed her entire adult life finally completed itself, 21 years late. She had carried his name from 14 until 38. They had never lived in the same house, and they ended in the same church, under the same roof, in Suffolk, with the Genesis carvings and the light coming through. She missed Elizabeth by 11 months. Queen Mary died on the 17th of November, 1558, and the 25-year-old woman who came to the throne that morning was the same child whose christening cloth Mary Howard had carried through the Church of the Observant Friars at Greenwich. At 14 years old, in September of 1533, her mother outlived her. Elizabeth Stafford, who had been married against her will at 17 and had spent 30 years telling the truth to people who could not afford to hear it, died in 1558, still furious, still unreconciled, having buried her husband, her son, and her daughter. What is left of Mary Howard is not much, and it is not nothing. The Devonshire Manuscript survived. It came out of that circle of women, and it went on existing, through the fall of the Howards and 2 changes of religion and 400 years, and it is now the single most important source we have for what educated English women were actually thinking in the 1530s. Not what men said they thought, what they wrote to each other, in a book that could be handed across a room. Her hand is on those pages. If she is the one who kept it, then everything we know from it, we know because of her. Her dower case survived as well, in the way legal victories survive quietly, in the record, available to be cited. She had established, against the direct opposition of the Crown, that a woman's property right did not evaporate because a king found it inconvenient. She did it at 21, with no husband, no family backing, and no money to speak of, by writing letters for 3.5 years and refusing to be tired out. And the children, Jane, Catherine, Margaret, all married into the northern nobility. Henry became a considerable figure at the court of James I and lived to be 73. And if you want to know what an intelligent, cautious, permanently watchful Howard looks like when he is allowed to grow old, look at him. Thomas, the boy of 11 who arrived at Reigate in 1547, became the 4th Duke of Norfolk and the premier peer of Elizabeth's England, and he never quite worked out how to be one. He allowed himself to be drawn into a scheme to marry Mary Queen of Scots, and then into a worse one, and he was executed on Tower Hill in 1572, first peer to be executed in Elizabeth's reign. His old tutor came to him at the end. John Foxay, who by then was the most famous religious writer in England, went to the Tower and was with Thomas Howard in his last days, and stood with him at the scaffold. Whatever Mary had built in that Surrey schoolroom, it held for 25 years, and it was still holding on the last morning. She could not have known that, and I find I want her to have known it. That is all of it. A woman who was handed to a boy at 14 for reasons that had nothing to do with either of them, who was widowed before she had lived a day of married life, who took on a king over money and beat him, who watched 2 cousins and an uncle and a brother die on the state's account and gave evidence in one of those cases, and never once afterwards tried to explain herself to anybody, who held a forbidden faith in silence for 20 years and then, when it was safe, said it not in a speech, but by hiring a schoolmaster. Here is where I want to leave her. At the beginning of tonight, I put a girl at a window at Kenninghall, 10 years old, looking out over a park, being told what she was going to be used for. Put her at a window again. Reigate. Some ordinary afternoon in the early 1550s. She is in her 30s. Downstairs there are 5 children being taught Greek by a man who will one day be read in every parish church in England, and she is the one who chose him. The estates outside the window are hers, in her own name, in law, because she wrote letters until the Crown gave in. Nobody in the house is going to be arrested this week. Nobody is going to ask her to marry anyone. Nobody is going to ask her what she believes. She is not waiting for anything. That is the thing I keep coming back to about her. For the first time since she was 9 years old, there is nothing in her life that is about to be decided by somebody else in a room she is not in. She had about 5 good years of that. It is not a great many. I hope they were quiet ones. Good night.